activate my womb tattoo. Have we ever officialized it? Because I'm not sure if we did. I'm not sure if we made it official, like, ever. So. Have we ever Makitin Copium? First of all, women. Do the women get, like, the fast pass when it comes to activating my womb tattoo as well? Let's see a pile driver. We need to call your name. Why, Kiki? That's like, it's just been making a light. Yeah, I had a lot of fun during that stream. It's just, I don't know, it's just chef's kiss. I know that AC6 is meant to be like enjoyed by playing AC6, but no! This game is secretly a dress-up game. Did you know that? It's secretly a dress-up game, therefore I will play it as such. It's a dress-up game! Much like Final Fantasy, it's a dress-up game. It's a dress-up game, guys. For you to dress-up game in First Guy, it's a dating sim!